Welcome to the Pivot Point podcast. This season, I'm focused on sharing stories and ideas from experts on diversity and inclusion. In this episode, I will share some insights and ideas from my guest expert, Bea Wray. Together, we will leave you with some actionable tips to think about and discuss with your organization. We share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you do not have to do it alone. At Pivot Point, I believe we are stronger together. We are one. So let's dig into this week's expert. I have with me today Miss Bea Wray, and she is author and motivational keynote speaker about executive leadership, entrepreneurship, innovation, and women in business. Corporations increase employee engagement and excellence through my engaging keynote presentations and active workshops on leadership lessons, professional development, and innovation. Associations and conference hire Bea to energize audiences around collaboration, building personal brands, and leveraging networks to grow network. She also has a forthcoming book, What Harvard Teaches, What Great Moms Already Know. So Bea, welcome. So great to have you.
Thank you, Julie. I'm so happy to be here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so tell us, how did you get into this line of work? I know you and I have a shared passion on women's leadership and women really being seen, heard, and belonging in the workplace. And I know you do all sorts of other things. So tell our listeners, why do you care about this? How did you get into this?
Sure. I appreciate the question. So I actually had the blessing. I've always been an entrepreneur, very limited time. I worked for a large company, Siemens, but for the most part, a 30-year career, starting businesses, helping other people start businesses, investing, etc. And I had one exit, which was lovely, and it afforded me the opportunity to take pretty much 6 years off to be a stay-at-home mom. And what was amazing was when it was time for me to go back to work, I was terrified. I thought, what could I possibly do? Do I have any skills? I had kind of, if you will, I'd been drinking the wrong Kool-Aid myself. We hear about our corporate worlds and we validate those, but we invalidate other aspects of our lives, especially as women, the collaboration and vision setting and communication and all sorts of important skills that can transfer from the home or from the community to the workforce. And so there I was, having had a very fulfilling 6 years, but felt empty from a perspective of what will I be able to offer. And so what happened was I did land an incredible job running a nonprofit that mentored and coached over 300 companies, and we hosted amazing events that drew people from around the world. But I couldn't understand, and I was receiving thank you notes every day because we help so many companies. And I kept asking myself, well, what am I doing for these people? And then I would ask the really important question, where did I get the skill to do what I'm doing for those people? And what was so amazing was the answer to that question was not my 20 plus years as an entrepreneur or in entrepreneurship. It was not that I had attended the Harvard Business School. The answer to the question of where did I get the skill to be able to help other companies almost always came from because I had been a mom.
Isn't that interesting?
It was very interesting to me. And so then that's really what lit my fire to think, did this only happen to me? Is this happening to other people? In what ways can I tap and leverage and communicate that so that I can stand up in the boardroom, or I can move forward with a client, or I can help talk about diversity? I can help a conversation where we start appreciating the whole person and a whole person's perspective and a whole person's skill set rather than some one line description that we feel world needs, because we are whole people that show up in collaboration rooms and in communication and in partnerships and in sales channels. And so really being able to break that down became a goal for me.
Yeah. So interesting. I work a lot with moms that are returning to the workforce, and they say a lot of what you said in your story. It's so relevant that experience managing a household, right? Managing a different type of business dynamic organizationally, but you're managing a lot of things. I mean, it's project management, it's influencing people to do things. It's budgeting. I mean, there's so many transferable skills that you highlighted from the home to the workplace. And, we have a workplace that still, even in 2020, is largely built for men to succeed in. And things haven't changed that much. And because men are generally, not always, the primary caregivers for children, the workplace it doesn't necessarily see that relevance, that transference. So I commend you for highlighting that and having, a keynote talk about that I've had the opportunity to see. And it's really nice how you use, a well-known institution like Harvard to say, hey, I learned this stuff, but where I really learned it and practiced it, was in a different context. And by the way, that parlays to this other great skill set that I now teach others about. So
Well,
thank
thank
you.
you. Yeah, of course. And one thing to give a little vision is I've followed Sheryl Sandberg, and of course, used to actually speak regularly in a panel about lean in. And one of the things that she talks about is that our careers are much more like a jungle gym than a corporate ladder. And she
Mhm.
encourages us to think about what are we learning wherever we are on the jungle gym. And so one quick way that I try to describe what I'm doing in my message is actually validating parenting as a relevant spot on that corporate jungle gym.
Mhm. That's so good. Yeah, and careers aren't linear. Gone are the days where people used to stay at an organization for 30 plus years because there were things like pensions and Rolexes and
Right.
there were a lot more incentives to be loyal. And what we know from millennials and certainly I suspect Gen Zers that are coming into the workforce is it's a very complex jungle gym. There's lots of moving parts and on average, young people stay in a job 2, 3, 4 years now, and that's just different than how it used to be. So I think we've known that for some time, but really having acceptance around that being the new career development model is that it's nonlinear, that it's messy, and there's the transferable skills factor will be so much more important in future workplaces because you don't have to know the industry. You don't have to have been there for 20 years to be an expert anymore. A lot of the things you can actually learn. It's oftentimes more important to hire people that have the right motivation and work ethic. You can't teach that always.
That's exactly right. And one of the things that I have found is stories from
Mhm.
home bring people together. So, for example, I might tell a story, and I might be trying to communicate perhaps a complicated um, illustration of where I think a company is going. And so often I have to lean on a story, an illustration that I've figured out with my children because it's more universal. If you talk about your kids,
Mhm.
everybody else has someone that they love, so they can kind of pause. They like the authenticity. They want to kind of get to know you. So immediately, these walls, these guarded personalities, that they kind of soften, and now we can hear the illustration, and oh, it might make sense. So I'll give you an example. As I was helping a company that was wanted very rapid growth, actually going from about 10 million to 100 million in a few years. So very rapid growth. And in order to do that, we decided we really needed to verticalize the whole company. So we had to have, a healthcare vertical and a financial vertical and so on and so forth, so that each of those could become the size of what used to be the whole company. And in doing so, it meant that the very senior people had to move.
Mhm.
They had to move positions that maybe someone was excellent in sales. Well, they had to move over to being finance CEO, which meant sales and marketing and what have you. And so it meant changing of skill sets. And there was one individual in particular that mitigated the risk because she had had experience in operations, in sales, and in marketing. And I said, because of you, Jen, we're all able to make this big shift because you can fit in. You're there to catch the problem. And I was trying to articulate this. And what ended up happening is I said, you're kind of like my son. And I didn't even know that I was going to go there. But my son plays basketball, happens to be 6'4". He was always the tall guy. And he actually has a decent outside shot, but he has no confidence in his outside shot. And the reason is he never has had the ability to take one in the game. He's never been able to take that risk, i.e., take a transition from one kind of role to this new vertical role. He's never been able to do that, but all of his teammates take these outside shots, these risky shots, and they pay no penalty because Robert is under the boards, grabbing the rebound, putting it back up. So the fact that they missed the first 10 or 20 times or however many in a season wasn't a big problem because Robert was so great at rebounding. He was the guy who picked up the pieces so they could take a risk. And when I explained that to Jen, I said, you are the person who can pick up the pieces. When I take this big risk, but I drop a ball in sales, you're there to pick that up for me. I drop a ball in operations. And when I put it in the words of like a story with my family, it was amazing how people congealed around an idea and got motivated and saw a vision. And I think it's because what we want in a diverse and inclusive environment is different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
So we need those things that we can gel to, that we can connect with. And often family is an equalizer.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that, Bea. And stories, we know, I mean, you and I both know as speakers, stories are powerful. They stick in people's brains far more than facts and figures and details. If someone says, I'm going to tell you a story, oh, that reminds me of a story, your brain lights up. There's 5 different areas activated versus 2 with simply just giving a directive to somebody. So it is an influential technique that I know you and I are passionate about and partnering on, doing some partnership work on storytelling. In the diversity space, I follow a thought leader, Jennifer Brown, who has a fantastic podcast. I'll give a shout out to The Will to Change. And she has everybody start with their diversity story. And that's something I talk about with leaders, especially those in the majority group that, are probably white, male, cisgender, straight, able-bodied, you name it. Those are just a few diversity layers. But, what ends up happening inside organizations is the majority group, who, by the way, is running most of the organizations and has the power and privilege to help, feels like they're not part of the conversation. So by owning their own diversity story, they can, just like you were saying, kind of disarm people and create vulnerability in a safe, brave place to facilitate, a pretty candid conversation that requires, some discomfort. And vulnerability is a nice vehicle to accelerate that conversation. So I appreciate
Absolutely.
those. And your son, I mean, who's not going to want to hear a story about your son basketball? Like, I'm curious where this is going. Right.
Right.
That's great.
He really enjoys that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good stuff. Well, I'm curious, Bea, speaking of stories, my listeners love kind of, I call them tales from the trenches, or, give us a window into your world. What types of stories are you hearing inside organizations of leaders, business owners, C-suite executives, of them getting this right, of being inclusive, of modeling good, healthy workplace behavior?
Oh, wow. That's a trick question, but it's a great question. I don't know that I am blessed to have seen a lot of people do some things really right.
Yeah.
And what it is not is some quota. I've seen some miserable stories with, we have X amount of quota that someone of this color versus that color, or this gender versus that gender, where I think companies are getting different perspectives, which is what they want.
Mm.
And they're getting able to, open markets with different perspectives, and they're able to have better communication, is that they are bringing people to the table, not in a forced way, not in a, it must be every, but just in an open way. And
Mhm.
it's more fluid. I think where there's been success is where there's, directional vision, not a quota. We must have X, but we more of a statement of values and a reason for why. So what we value
Mhm.
is diversity and inclusion. How we see that is
good.
all of those things that you talked about. In age, and it's not limited. It's, for example, and then
Mhm.
there's a long list. So it's fluid, it's open, it's more anecdotal in its move forward, which always amazingly leads to those numeric statistical improvements.
Mhm.
But I have found that when you're aiming for those, sustainability falls off, and so do other metrics. And
Yeah.
so where I have seen success is companies opening conversations. I've had the great blessing to be the keynote speaker or a speaker in groups of D&I offices. And it's very much, my main goal is not to come up and show tactics. My main goal is to come be authentic.
Yep.
Um, and if I can illustrate being authentic, it turns out that other people start bringing their guards down, and that's where conversations start happening.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good stuff. Yeah. It is. You give people permission to mirror that, right? To kind of pick up your authenticity and be like, okay, this is a safe place for me to be my authentic self as well. Um, and I like what you said, vision, core values. A lot of the companies we work with, most organizations I work with have core values. Now, the difference is, how do they incorporate something like inclusion and diversity? And then more importantly, do people really know the values, right? They're usually on a wall or the website, and people are like, oh, yeah, what are those again? And then do they know how to align behavior with those values? Do they know inbounds and out of bounds behaviors? So once you get crystal clear on that and you have the wrapper of inclusion around it, you are much more likely to have a diverse workplace where everyone feels seen, heard, and belong. And that vision doesn't have to be a quota, like you said. It kind of affirmative action, definitely reparations are needed to close some of the gaps, but affirmative action really drove some negative behavior where people did see it as a zero sum game. We have to have this many people of color, this much of certain genders. And, I'm seeing, in the news, it's interesting, starting here in 2020, some legislation getting passed to mandate companies to be a certain way. We're seeing some industry leaders like Intel set a standard for the companies they do business with on what they have to look like and report on diversity numbers. So I think we're kind of in this crux of, is the pendulum gonna swing so that, it's required to accelerate change, or can we keep, doing it on our own because it's the right thing to do? So it's always a challenge to motivate behavior change and accelerate change in the workplace when it's so much easier to stay the status quo, not change. Change is hard.
Right. And what looks like change and feels like change to some, because the first step is always the hardest,
Mhm.
doesn't sometimes feel or get seen as changed by someone else.
Mhm.
And that's a thing I work on with my children, is trying not to be the mom who says, your best isn't good enough, right?
Mhm.
Trying to meet people where they are and be encouraging. Gosh, I'm so happy you took that first step. Way to go. Living in that, being appreciative of that, seeing how does that feel, and then kind of setting what would it look like to grow from here, as opposed to
Mm.
saying, well, gee, I really needed you to take 10 steps. You only took one, which can be, of course, really deflating. And they're thinking, well, why did I bother?
Right.
And so I think that that's a parallel of one of the challenges, or some of the challenges we see in these areas too, is um, there's a huge variety in people's companies' skill set in how they are able to embrace diversity and inclusion. And sometimes that means that what actually is actually big steps or hard steps get overshadowed. And I think we will do well to say, hey, there's a needle, it was moved. How does that feel? What's happening? How do we look at that? How do we look at the growth there? Boy, wouldn't it be neat if you could take it one more step?
Mhm. Yeah. Affirm what has been done rather than focusing on what has not been done, which is sometimes easier to do.
Of course. And you and I have talked about this, where we don't ever want to promote the victim mentality. We never
Right.
want to talk about all those things that can be done by the people who are not in the room. So I don't exclusively speak to women, but very often I'm the keynote speaker at a women's conference.
Yeah.
And so to me, I've just recently spoke to a group, there's 500 women in the room. No way am I going to sit around and talk about those bad guys that don't pay you enough, or the, gender pay gap, if only those people would be smarter and pay you, because
Yep.
they're not in the room. There's no reason to have that conversation. What I want to say is, assume everyone in the world is trying to be fair. Assume companies just want to win, right? Like when my son doesn't get to play basketball, back to him, I always say, never met a coach who didn't want to win, right? It's the same thing. Assume companies are trying their best. So what do we need to do? Do we need to raise our hand more? Do we need to give ourselves credit for our experience rather than, only give ourselves half credit? Do we need to take a victory lap? There are things, and I'm not trying to um, belittle the victim or cast the victim. I'm trying to say, let's take hold of what we can, what each person can, whether I'm talking to a young man or an elder woman or whomever. But I try to never waste time talking about what someone who's not here could do for me.
Yeah.
That's useless.
Yeah. Yeah. And then we need to have our allies, right? That's what I call them in the conversation, especially women's conferences. There's some that, are doing a good job of getting 10, 20, 30% male allies attending so they can be a part of the conversation, because you're right. There's no use in talking about issues that adversely affect underrepresented groups just amongst underrepresented groups, right? The power lies, the decision making generally lies in the majority group. And so, how do we engage them in the conversation? And so, really creating some psychological safety in those brave places for people to have tools and talk tracks and, know what to say and what not to say. But I agree. There's this balance of owning your story, right? We've talked a lot about that, and knowing who you are not, and advocating for yourself as women. But then there's this also part of like, hey, we can't do it by ourselves. 50% of the population is not going to solve 100% of the problem. So how do we engage and ask for help? It's okay to get help from other people, which, being a mom, sometimes that's one of the hardest things to do. And we see that with women in the workplace. Asking for help is actually a sign of strength. It's okay to ask people for help. They actually feels really good for people to feel like they helped someone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that makes good sense. But the problem is there is a value to it. It's just not a productive value. The value is people actually pay a ticket and they feel good. So they don't feel good. They feel connected
Yep.
briefly. It's like, you might feel great eating that cookie, but later you feel bad about it. But for a brief moment, it feels good to say, oh, woe is me. And
Hmm.
I think that not only do we have to say yes to the things that are productive and will move us farther, but we have to say no to those things that will ultimately hold us back.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, the woe is me is one of those important things to say no to.
Right. Yep. We have choices on what we focus on. So I'm curious, B, knowing what you know and being on stages and being in rooms where inclusion and certainly about women is such a hot topic right now. What do you recommend to our listeners that want to engage more and learn more about you?
Oh, well, I'd love to be connected via social media. My name is Bea, and then my last name is Wray. I tease that Siri, who I talk to every morning to ask and make phone calls, etc., has moved from artificial intelligence to motivational speaker herself, because every day she tells me to be a Ray. Be a Ray, she says. So that's what I get told in the morning. But I do have a web page that where I would love to hear feedback through the commentary and or just sign up for the newsletter. But my web page for the book coming up is the same as my TEDx title, and that's What Harvard Taught Me But My Kids Made Me Learn. So it's a big
Mhm.
mouthful, but it hopefully makes sense. What Harvard Taught Me But My Kids Made Me Learn.com, or just my name, BeaWray.com. And I have had so much fun connecting with women around the world. It was actually my 50th birthday that I gave myself the present of putting on my first webinar of that title.
Mm.
And, by 7 a.m., I was getting encouragement from Australia and Tallinn and Budapest. And so it turns out that
Mm.
uh, what we're talking about is truly universal.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's something that's just here domestically. It's everywhere. That's excellent. Well, awesome. Well, we'll link to both those websites in the show notes. And B, it's been such a pleasure to be with you today. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you, Julie. It's fabulous.
Did you know that you can find all 5 seasons of our 50 plus episodes at nextpivotpoint.com? And you can sign up for a complimentary 7-day preview of our new program, Lead Like an Ally, and order our new book, Lead Like an Ally. I appreciate you listening to this episode. Who do you know that needs to hear this message? Hit the share button and connect with me on LinkedIn. Simply search Julie Kratz. I post daily. Kratz is how to spell my last name. I host this podcast because I believe we are stronger together. We are one.